Thank you so much. Hope you've all enjoyed the fantastic discussion so far, and certainly more to come. And welcome to this session on The View from the Inside, where we're going to be looking at the political outlook for 2024. Please remember to jump into Pigeonhole, add in your questions, really helpful, up on stage here to see what it is that everyone in the room and online wants to hear from our panellists. We've got a great panel here. So joining me, we've got Claire Armstrong, National Political Editor from news.com.au, Patricia Carvallis from RN Breakfast on the ABC, and very kindly joining us live from Washington, DC, we have Adam Creighton from The Australian. So thank you very much. Claire, I'm going to start with you and just a fairly broad question about what are we seeing in terms of political terms for 2024? There had been talk about an early election that seems to have been pretty quashed, but it does seem that we're in election mode already. How is that influencing policy, reform agenda, and everything playing out in the political side?
I would say certainly once we get through this next budget in, post-May, we are, as the PM like to say, in the 12-month period of an election year. That's just constitutionally required at that point. But that will obviously cast a lens over, it's a countdown clock, what the government hopes to achieve. There's a few things that they have to stick the landing on. A key one that hasn't really been touched on yet, but is likely that the government will come up with an emissions reduction target for 2035. There will be some more domestic kind of policy around cost of living relief, probably a renewed focus again on housing. The government also has an enormous number of reviews currently out in the field that it needs to get back and turn around responses to quite quickly. But given, as you say, we are getting into that period where we talk about re-election, that will probably form the basis of their 2025 platform. The Universities Accord, for example, is due to come out tomorrow. That's been a big review process of that whole sector. You've got Mark Butler, the Health Minister, has a number of reviews going on, everything from health in regional areas to mental health. There's the delivery on the response to the infrastructure review. There's a lot of things that the government sort of set in motion that it will just be bringing back, making policy decisions on. Productivity Commission report on childcare. So there's a lot that they sort of set in motion last year that they will be some delivering in this budget, but a lot of it setting up as their sort of re-election platform.
And Patricia, I'll move on to you. And yes, how do you see the federal government's agenda playing out this year, particularly in light of the fact that we've got a by-election coming up here in Victoria in just a couple of weeks? And how is that influencing the federal government's take on things?
Yeah, I think the by-election has certainly sharpened the focus of the government on issues around cost of living. And I think the big change we saw on the stage 3 tax cuts was framed much more broadly than that by-election, but I do think that the timing, trying to get it out ahead of that, and also for both good and bad reasons, the good reasons being you need to be transparent, you can't be seen to hide it, but equally the government didn't take a gamble, it didn't think it would win. And I think if you look at some of the early polling, it's having some success on redistributing wealth, which it essentially has done through changing the stage 3 tax cuts. So yes, that election will be quite pivotal to some other decisions I think you might see. And, the government will tell you that the by-election is not a referendum on its tax cuts, for instance, because it doesn't want it to be seen through that prism, and who does, because there are many issues. But I do think that that people will see it in that context. In terms of their broader agenda, last year, because of the referendum on the Voice, the government, fairly and unfairly, in my view, was seen as taking its ball off cost of living, which clearly is, the barbecue stopper of our time. And I think this year will be consistently about them putting both the aesthetic and the genuine focus on the issues of cost of living. So budget, obviously, will be where it delivers on some of that. I think the competition reviews that we're seeing, ACCC is looking at it, Craig Emerson is looking at the food and grocery code. Having tougher regulation around pricing across the board and needing to deliver, not just talk tough. Now, at the moment, it's very rhetorical, what we're hearing from the government, and I think the rhetoric, can I say, politically, is pretty much bang on. People are very frustrated by, the cost of living and their perception, and I think rightly, that, that these big companies, and obviously in the food sector, are really benefiting enormously. The government will need to actually deliver genuine reforms and not just keep talking about it for many months. So I think that competition piece is going to be big this year. The other one, and Claire's already touched on it, so I don't want to be repetitive, but is housing. And they are very worried about housing. They're very frank in private conversations that they think this is really causing much angst. They're going to have pressure from the left, already they do, from the Greens on housing and renters, but also on the right, because in coalition, I think there has been a reckoning around this too. Now, the Greens will try and make it about, negative gearing, capital gains tax, all of those issues. That is obviously dangerous territory for the government politically, so it will need other solutions and sticks when it comes to rents and other things to look like it's providing meaningful reform. Some of it might be contentious, but, supply is obviously the big question. I don't think it's answered those questions enough, and I think you'll see more.
Thanks. We might come back and talk about housing in a bit more detail later on as well. Adam, I'll throw to you here, and we had a panel on the global economic outlook actually to start us off this morning, and not that surprisingly, there was quite a lot of talk about the US economy, and the US economy has actually been pretty good, particularly if we're comparing to where we thought it might be a year ago. How is that playing out on the ground, and how is that matching with consumer sentiment in the US?
Yeah, certainly. Well, firstly, thanks for having me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in the room. It's always more fun in person. But yeah, look, the aggregate figures have been quite good. GDP growth is strong in the US. It's above 2%. And of course, just like in Australia, you've got that extremely low jobless rate, which has really shocked everyone since the pandemic. These are the lowest jobless rates since the 1960s in the US. That's very impressive. But those figures haven't translated into consumer confidence, really. I mean, surveys of Americans show that they're very disappointed with the economy. And I think that all comes down to prices, basically, the huge price increases. I mean, most ordinary people don't really care about GDP. They barely know what it is. And of course, it's nice to have a low unemployment rate, but from the perspective of an individual, it doesn't really affect their life, whether the unemployment rate is high or low. I mean, that is if you have a job. So the focus is all on prices, and the consumer price index in the US has gone up 18% since the end of 2020, and certainly that's a lot more than most people's wages. Certainly a lot more than my wage. It has gone up. So people are understandably frustrated about that, and then at the same time you have people who have been paying down their savings. So there were huge injections during COVID from the federal government, massive cash injections into household balances. Trillions of dollars, and they've pretty much been spent now by the end of last year. And so from the personal point of view, people are upset. And just to give you some particular purchases, especially if you're at the younger end of the age bracket and you're thinking of buying a home in the US, the median house price in the US basically hovered at about $340,000 US for 5 years practically leading up to the pandemic. And since then, it's jumped 25% to $420,000. So that's a massive increase. And of course, at the same time, you've had mortgage rates go from about 3 to about 7%. So not only has the purchase price gone up, but to borrow money to pay has actually doubled. So certainly if you're young, you'd be very frustrated about that. And then the other extraordinary factor is used cars. Most people buy used cars here because obviously they're a lot cheaper, and they've gone up 18% as well, after flatlining for a very long time. So these big ticket items have gone up. I think that's fed into consumers being upset, no matter how many times they're told by analysts and by economics journalists that things are great. When you go to the supermarket, you're reminded all the time that they're not. So I think that explains it basically.
Thanks, Adam, and I think some similar issues playing out here in Australia as well. The topic of tax reform has come up a few times already today, and not surprisingly is coming up in the questions here. We did have this discussion about the stage 3 tax cuts, so it's been in the news a lot recently. How has that changed really been felt by the community? And is that influencing, the government's agenda on tax reform? And, is there some appetite for some genuine tax reform rather than tinkering around the edges? Claire, I'll start with you, but interested in other...
A figure I saw, I think I wrote this story. There was some polling out earlier this week. Yeah, it was. There was some polling out earlier this week around, are you happy with stage 3 changes? And consistently all the polls have shown, yes, the community, at least over 50% think that was the right decision for the government to make. But the figure that really jumped out at me on this poll, that's name escapes me right now, was even though I think 52% of the country had said, yep, we think this is great, only 30% thought that they were better off under the tax changes. So I think that has a long way to play. We often talk about in political journalism, by the time you as a journalist are absolutely sick to death of hearing a PM or a minister talking about something, it might have just started to register in the minds of voters. That's what's going to be the government's focus over the next, to the election, 12 to 18 months, is just constantly hammering home to people, you, the 80-odd% of taxpayers, benefit from our changes. I mean, we know they're spending $40 million on a big advertising campaign through Treasury. So just as an aside, that's like the community reaction. I think that speaks to how difficult it is to have a conversation with the general voting public about taxes, of all the different kind of taxes a government could touch. Income is the one that directly interfaces with the largest number of people. It's very easy for people to understand. They see it weekly, fortnightly in their pay packet. So to then say that there's, they're struggling to have that conversation, I do not think that the government is setting out to have some amazing tax reform agenda in other more complex spaces in the next 18 months. It's why they're focusing so much, as was said, on productivity and things like that, grow your way out of some of their revenue issues, rein in the NDIS, things like that, rather than have conversations I just don't think this government is necessarily prepared to have.
Yeah, we talk about bravery when it comes to tax reform, right? And it's become very cool to talk. Firstly, the word reform is way overused. What reform? It's all about what your own perspective is about what that reform should look like, right? That's my first view, because people will call something reform which other people consider to be regressive, and then the other way around, the argument will be made too. So, you'd expect that the stage 3 tax cut changes, I think, are popular broadly because if you look at the numbers, I mean, it makes sense, right? It's like not brain surgery. That's where the majority of people earn income, and they obviously feel pretty good about getting more. What I'm sure Adam will comment more on this, because obviously I watch the world, not just my own country, but Biden also isn't seeing a kind of a political dividend for some pretty decent economic numbers as well. And I think our government here is suffering the same kind of fate. So Jim Chalmers will say, well, we're paying down debt, and he has been banking some of the revenue that's coming in. They're not spending it all. That is a fact. Do people reward that politically? Well, no. Is the government really prepared to take on big vested interests, like, for instance, in the property sector, when there isn't a political consensus? And I heard some of the Teal candidates before, they might be saying they have appetite for it. But can you imagine the vicious campaign from vested interests, perhaps the opposition, who keeps asking them to rule it out? You have to build a political consensus. You can't go and do political suicide. So when we talk about bravery, the reason it's used in that way is because it can be crazy brave. You have to build a community consensus. And the only reason we saw a shift on stage 3 is there was Labor Party research which showed them that consensus had been made. The scare campaign around something like changing negative gearing is ferocious. And is it worth it for the sort of budget implications? Does it have enough of a dividend when it comes to housing? Does it really change the housing landscape enough? No, I don't think they would. The calculation is not. That's why I think you should be looking at other areas in terms of housing and what they might be able to do. And it might be, in the infrastructure spend, sort of big government kind of stuff, because that's where I think it's easier to see a political dividend. I think you're right that they're not getting rewarded so much for the tax cuts, and also there's a bit of a delay till people see it in their pocket. But people know that there is a shift and that they've made a choice to back them, and I think that on balance that will work well for them. So I don't think there's any huge reform you'll see, but the more people put all of these reforms and build a consensus, that's when the government will step in, when that's been created. One more comment about stage 3 tax cuts. It was only after a huge community consensus was established that the government stepped in. That went on and on. That was actually a very strong campaign, the stage 3 tax cut, change it discourse. If the same were to happen on all of those other issues, I do think that you might see a preparedness, but the government has shown that they expect that political calculation to work in a succession. And at the moment, I don't see that the tipping point has been reached.
So you've all touched on various aspects of a bit of a disconnect between what's playing out in the economy and politically and what's being felt by the community. And we've got a couple of our top questions actually are coming through about trust, and trust both in media outlets and trust both in politics. And Adam, I'll start with you on this one. Is that part of the issue we're seeing with some of this disconnect and people not feeling necessarily like they're getting the benefits from what's going on in the economy, or that politicians are working in their best interests? What's the role of the media in that, and what's also where is that lack of trust coming from?
Yeah, it's certainly true that trust in the US in all the major institutions, whether it's Congress, the White House, the media, the courts, all of it has fallen dramatically. It's quite scary, actually, if you look at the figures. It's much worse than in Australia, I understand, although I haven't been home for a while, but I think it's pretty scary. I mean, the polarisation, as you know, we talk about it all the time. It's very, very extreme here. News outlets are increasingly captured by their readers, and they tend to serve up stories or emphasise things that the readers want to hear, and that happens both on the left and the right. And so you end up with these two kind of information silos where both sides hate each other. It's partly a function of economics because of the changing economics of the media industry. It's no longer funded by advertising, but that's kind of another issue. But a society here is much more fractious. I mean, it's a cliche to say America's more divided than ever. That's not true. If you go back to the 60s, obviously there were riots, massive riots throughout the US all the time. So it has been more divided over policy, but certainly it's bad now. And I'm just going to add on to what Patricia was saying about political dividends. I think the Biden administration has not got any, and they've been quite productive from a legislation point of view. In fact, the first 3 years, they've passed 4 or 5 major pieces of legislation in the Congress, which is a difficult thing to do. I mean, you may think that they're bad pieces of legislation, but he still passed them. And there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially a big climate change bill. There was an infrastructure bill, $1 trillion. There was gun reform. There was the COVID bill. So a lot's been done, but the approval ratings for the president and for Democrats more generally have been getting worse or flatlining. So there's been no political dividend there. Which suggests that the idea. But in Australia we always talk about there being a political dividend for doing things. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case in the US at the moment.
Any other comments on trust and the role in media and political institutions?
I would say domestically, it was really interesting having, obviously, the independent MPs up before. They feel very strongly that their role in the parliament at the moment is to restore some of that trust and transparency. I think a lot of them have met the realities of being in a minority. They don't hold any kind of real voting power yet, who's to say in 12 months' time in the lower house. But there was, I think, that they were elected on this collective kind of wave of an expression from the community that was they expect more. And Anthony Albanese, as he became Prime Minister, would frequently say, I want to do things differently. And on many accounts, this government has taken steps to rebuild that trust, things that will take time to pay off, establishing a National Anti-Corruption Commission, things like that. But on other things, it's same, different day. This government is really reticent to reveal ministerial diaries, to talk about, where VIP flights go, to properly act on real-time disclosure of political donations. So, yeah, I think the community has done all it really can and continues to demonstrate a desire for this. In terms of the political response, I don't think any government has yet met the moment. And obviously that is where the media are supposed to step in and create an extra, the fourth estate to continue to push for that. Sometimes I think we do well and sometimes I think we really fail. And that's a constant progress thing for the media.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm troubled by the hyperpolarisation of the media because I think you need independence, impartiality, and obviously, that's kind of key to being able to call out bad behaviour or bad policy based on evidence, regardless of what your perspective is. But if a policy purports to do something and it's not having that impact, then you have to call it out. And actually, we talked about mentioning that, the early childhood stuff, for instance. I mean, Labor said they wanted cheaper childcare. They have delivered cheaper childcare, but clearly childcare and women's participation in work is like sort of this looming, still strong issue. And so they will need to do more on all of those things to meet the demand of the community rather than just talk about it. So there are ways to restore trust, but that insiders-outsiders thing, which is essentially what the Trump base is feeling, and the idea that there's an establishment which has entrenched interests that are opposed to the media or whatever, elites versus non-elites, some of them false binaries, but either way, strongly believed. I think the only thing that protects us against some of the excesses of that is compulsory voting in this country. But we still have, the move away from the mainstream parties is a signal of that. And so I think the Labor Party knows it's real. I think the opposition needs to be very careful that they don't follow the populist path because it's tempting. I get it. But there are dangers in it. And, you famously will remember John Howard stood up, for instance, to One Nation all those years ago. The populist path would have been to take another one, but you need to be in the realm of actually building institutions. Community cohesion at the moment is at a very low point, which is something I'm completely obsessed with, because I think it's going to get worse and worse and worse unless we have leaders that are prepared to kind of bring together, as utopian as it sounds, because that will lead to even more mistrust. And obviously this war we're seeing in the Middle East has led to a lot of these tensions, but they are happening here in real time, and they will have policy and political implications unless they're addressed.
Adam, Patricia mentioned Trump there, and you probably won't be surprised to hear that the number one thing all of our panellists talking about the global economic outlook this morning said they were looking at this year is the US election.
Funny that.
So it's looming over not just the US, but everywhere, including here in Australia. How is that shaping up, and what might a Trump presidency mean for Australia?
Well, it's, you've probably heard that somewhat remarkably in the polls and in the betting markets, Donald Trump is well ahead. I just checked the average of the bookies' odds for who's going to be president in November, win in November, and Donald Trump's on 45% and Joe Biden's on 29%. That's quite an extraordinary difference from what most people, including myself, thought 1 year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago when Donald Trump launched his campaign in Mar-a-Lago. Everyone was writing him off and making fun of him because of his legal woes. He has been midterm elections. Republicans did badly, and it was often blamed on him, his choices. But look, he's proved everyone wrong. It's been an extraordinary political comeback. And I think he just, feasts or benefits from this widespread dislike that the establishment have for him. I think because he's so hated by the establishment in both parties, not just Democrats but also Republicans, a huge chunk of the electorate really likes that. They kind of see him as their representative. However badly he's behaved in the past, he's kind of all they have. And so if you had to bet right now, he he probably will win. I mean, it's still 10 months away, so, you know, a lot can happen. I mean, Biden's performance is increasingly poor, and I think it's a huge problem for the Democrats. And I think there's a lot of thinking going on as to whether they have to try to convince him to step aside before the Democrat convention in August, where they can, you know, basically choose someone else at the last minute. I mean, that's going to depend, I guess, on, you know, on his performance over the next few months. But I mean, for instance, he was the first president in many, many years not to do the Super Bowl softball interview at halftime, which is just a 10-minute interview, which is normally a president would jump at that, but his staff clearly didn't feel that he was up to it. And a lot of people are talking about that over here now. And there's a lot of senior Democrats in the New York Times, you know, who are favourable to him, who are now saying that he should stand aside. But how do you do that? I mean, if the president does not want to step aside, I mean, there's no way of forcing the issue. So, what does it mean for Australia if we have a Trump presidency again? Well, it's a lot more unpredictable, that's for sure. I mean, some experts say that he'll be favourable to AUKUS. Others say that he won't be favourable to AUKUS. So, look, I mean, who knows? I mean, I interviewed Steve Bannon recently, and he's close to Trump, and he was saying that Trump, you know, will support AUKUS because he likes a good deal, and certainly the Americans are, you know, getting a good deal from us, at least financially, from selling those subs if they can be produced. But you know, what else? I mean, more generally, the NATO issue is not so much about NATO. I think it's more about Americans frustrated that they don't have free healthcare, they don't have all this stuff the Europeans have, and of course Australians too. And the reason for that basically is because such a massive chunk of America's budget goes to the military. And so I think that's where the anger about NATO comes from. You know, what it means with China, who knows? I mean, he did a town hall last night, and he was very proud of his tariffs on China, and basically saying he was right because, you know, Biden hadn't taken them off, which is true. Biden has not taken them off. But look, it's just going to be unpredictable. You know, he's very personality based. I mean, I think people exaggerate the dangers. I mean, I don't think he's going to be a dictator. If he was going to be a dictator, he would have in the first 4 years, you know, when he was president. You know, I just think he wants to, you know, he just wants to prove everyone wrong. But you know, it's going to be a rocky 4 years.
Patricia, any comments on how that might play out for Australia? And is our federal government preparing for what a change in US presidency might mean for things like AUKUS?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And they're like, they won't publicly say it because it's, you know, part of the standards of, and I think it's a good decision that we support democracies in other countries and not trying to, you know, have a view on other people's elections. Not that we'd be as deluded as to think that we'd have any impact anyway if they said anything, but you shouldn't seek to pretend to either or say anything. And obviously Australia will maintain its relationship with the US. Remember, there are a lot of people in high places that maintain that relationship outside of the official elected people, and those administrations operate, those bureaucracies operate, and they just continue to, regardless of administration. But yes, the federal government is concerned about a Trump presidency, its potential implications for maybe things like AUKUS. Although, again, Adam is right. They're not sure. And that's the point. It's the unpredictability. And governments don't like that. Neither do bureaucracies. You like to predict. When we talk about the rules-based order, it's because, you know, there are rules that we stick to, and there is a certain predictability. And so when there is an unpredictable, especially when it's your biggest, you know, ally, and you can't be sure of the way they'll behave on the world stage or in relation to you, then that is risky. And so there is risks with the Trump presidency that everyone is aware of. The other day, for instance, Julian Leeser, who hasn't been yet brought back to the front bench for Peter Dutton, was quite upfront with me about it. I was a bit surprised, actually, on Q&A on Monday night, and said, yeah, like, he does not think Trump should be the leader. Now, he's a backbencher and he's got the freedom to say what he really thinks, right? But that sort of speaks, if that's like a conservative, that's an old school conservative, yeah? Not a radical, which is what Trump is. So, yes, there is a concern about how this will end. I think there's also a concern in the Democrats now in the United States about Joe Biden and whether he should be the candidate, because it's not, I don't think, just a right-wing conspiracy to ask questions about Joe Biden's performance. It's, you know, if you want, if this is the most important role in the Western world, in the free world, then you do want your best candidate. And so I do think there are going to be some hard conversations because everyone around the world, including their allies, are asking questions.
Yeah.
Any comments, Claire?
I'll leave it to the experts.
Look, we've talked a lot about what's happening with the current government, but obviously we're in lead up to election. We need a bit more focus on what the opposition is doing. And what are the policies? One of the big, most popular questions coming through here is what are the most constructive policies that the federal opposition has, and also where is the community support for the opposition? How's that coming through? Claire, I'll start with you.
This is going to sound harsher than it's intended, but they don't yet have any, which is okay this far out from an election, as much as we'd love to have a real contest of ideas. This budget, so the budget reply for the opposition, will be where they really put a foundational kind of core platform announcement. Think of Labor announcing childcare subsidies and then spending 12 months prosecuting that argument when they're in opposition. All signs point to some serious movement around housing. As PK sort of said, there's a real recognition, and housing is the real equaliser in terms of how many voters from very different positions in life have a stake, whether you're a young person trying to get into the market, whether you're a parent terrified about your child getting into the housing market, whether you're moving toward retirement and you're thinking about your house as more of an asset. So there are lots of voters have a lot of buy-in to housing. So I would say put your money on a policy there. The one policy that Dutton has confirmed in that space, it was from the previous coalition government, was the 11th hour announcement of allowing people to dip into their superannuation to contribute to buying a house. They've continued that, but that is not really a substantive kind of policy in that sense. So there will be some movement on energy. They will have to come up with some other kind of cost of living policies, but that probably won't come until quite late in the election cycle because, of course, as oppositions often complain, if they do genuinely come up with a good idea, the government tends to just pinch it and make it their own. In terms of how the coalition being received at Dunkley in 2 weeks' time will be a really interesting test of that, not necessarily indicative of how things will go at the general election. Traditionally, as the PM has been running around telling everyone, there's often a 7% swing against a government in a by-election. Obviously, Dunkley is held on a margin of about 6.3%, so he's just covering for if there is, the natural kind of anti-government send-a-message swing. I'm not sure that's certainly not what the coalition are running around talking about. I think they'd be pretty happy with a 2 to 3% swing to say, they've really shaved off the government's hold on that, mortgage bellwether kind of seat. And Dunkley's interesting because it's got a lot of the people the coalition are really trying to target at the next election, this kind of goat track, sidestepping some of those teal seats to get those outer suburban mortgage bell, you're buying a big car because you drive a long way. A lot of those issues you'll see Dutton prosecute. Whether the community buys into those is as much up to how Albanese performs in the next 12 months as to Dutton, because it will still, I think, this early in Labor's sort of time in government, be much more a referendum about their performance than a sudden wave of support for an alternative.
Yeah, I think you're bang on, and I think this particular electorate is actually like the sort of electorate that Peter Dutton, if he doesn't win, he's really got to do something about that teal strategy because,
yeah.
And it's not a very multicultural seat compared to some of the other seats. It's a very white seat. It's there's a lot of renters in it. There's struggle in it. As you say, the large distances. It's really interesting in that sense. And so you would think that some of the messages that the coalition has been trying to send are about that. So have you noticed in the last week that the coalition is very keen to talk about border security and national security? That is not accidental, sort of accidentally fall into some of these arguments. I think it's trying to test some other issues. That's because the broken promise on stage 3 tax cuts isn't landing politically. If anything, if you look at some of the focus groups that, for instance, the Redbridge group did, they say that they're one of the independent polling, if anyone doesn't know, they talk about basically people are really disengaged. Now, that's dangerous for the government, though, because that's disengaged and a bit sort of grumpy with cost of living. You'll vote against a government. All of the things that you hear them say, which I'm sure you know, are about expectation management. And, Albanese makes the claim about big swings. He's actually right. And particularly where they are in the election cycle, you will, I do think if you don't see a big swing against the government, that would be unusual. They unexpectedly won the Aston by-election. They were kind of shocked about that. They thought it was coming, by the way. They did have a feeling about it, but they were also shocked because they thought that cost of living would have had more of an impact then. Now we're down the track. It is having an impact. People are really frustrated. Has Peter Dutton, you asked about opposition policies, provided a suite of alternatives? No. And on stage 3, they're saying there'll be reform, and they've put tax and income tax on the agenda. But how? What? Are they going back to that flatter tax system? Well, it'll cost a lot. What else gets cut? Can you think about the Labor Scare campaign if they promise that they'll keep that flatter tax? The money has to come from somewhere. Someone will miss out. And, of course, winners and losers is essentially where politics is won and lost. So Dunkley will be interesting, but we also shouldn't kind of over-reg that Dunkley represents the whole nation, or it will be the same as a general election.
Bit of a follow-up on opposition. One of the questions coming through here, a bit of a comment as well, is that a lot of the business sector is feeling a lack of engagement with the coalition and a lack of understanding of business challenges. Is that something you're seeing play out, and what's behind that?
This is so interesting that's happened in the last 12 or so months. Big business, in a lot of ways, has no friends in Canberra right now. I think they would say that traditionally when there's a Labor government, they're expecting to have big fights on IR and other things like that, which we've obviously seen huge tranches of reforms rammed through Parliament in the last 18 months on multiple industrial relations issues. But also, business is not finding an ally in the coalition, or at least a Dutton-led coalition at the moment. And that is the compounding factor of there is a lot of genuine anger about the way that big business backed in the Voice. There is a resistance from the coalition. Like one of the most harmful things to Albanese last year, aside from the Voice, was his perceived closeness with Qantas. Dutton doesn't want to be buddy-buddy with Woolworths. He doesn't want to be buddy-buddy with an airline. So where the coalition are actually really focused and engaging is small, medium, mum and dad, family businesses, sole traders, tradies. That will be where the coalition is seeking input and wants to develop policies. So it doesn't surprise me that businesses feel that they're not getting engagement from the coalition, because I don't think the coalition is seeking it.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to populism, to be honest, and that road we were talking about. The Trump, big end of town rhetoric is the same reason. The Woolies and the Australia Day thongs to, the Voice and, these woke agendas, gay marriage a couple of years ago for Qantas. These are and there is obviously anger in the community about big business. Look at the moment, Coles and Woolies are under pressure. I think that sentiment makes sense. I know why people feel that way. I find it hard to go to the supermarket too, and I'm not a low-income earner. I just find it's very expensive to go to the supermarket. It's hard going to the supermarket. No one's having a good time at the supermarket. And so why would you want to be hanging out with any of those guys, right? I can understand the optics. Equally, they're the biggest employers in the country. And so it's the heart and soul of capitalism in this country. And so you do need engagement from the major parties as well. And I think that populism is a dangerous road to go down because, am I right?
Yeah, well, this is where you have the PM saying that Dutton single-handedly wanted to sack all 200,000 whatever workers at Woolies by boycotting them over the Australia Day merge. So, yes.
You can still get thongs.
Trying on one issue.
Yeah, Adam?
Yeah, so just on the policy areas that a coalition might want to pursue. I mean, of course, they look to the US for ideas, and And there has been interest. I mean, I can't recall which coalition MPs I spoke to, but they have, that they're interested, or at least some were, in the ability to have these 30-year fixed home loans, right, to buy a house, which the US has, right? It's a very popular, very appealing idea. Now, of course, in Australia, that does not exist, right? I mean, most people have variable loans. That's risky. It's stressful. And if you want a fixed rate, you pay a lot more. So maybe that's going to be an area. I mean, I don't know for sure, but that would seem to me to set up a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac type thing in Australia and get a 30-year home loan. That would be popular, right? So that's one area. And I think maybe they're going to look at nuclear energy too, because the Biden administration's pushing it very hard over here, actually. Trying to increase nuclear now. There's been a big flip in the past few years, right? There's a realization that, solar and wind is not going to be able to get to 100% carbon free, at least in the US, it certainly won't. And you need nuclear power. So maybe there'll be something on that. And then finally, I think there'll be a big argument over EVs in Australia, because that's just shaping up here now. So we just saw recently, Biden administration's going to dump probably these tough standards that it was going to introduce, that all new sales had to be electric by 2032. And that's kind of embarrassing for the administration, because they really championed this idea in 2021. But the economic reality is not, it's falling short of hopes, right? The battery prices are going up, the cars are expensive, people aren't buying them, and so they're having to temper their forecasts. And I think that's something in Australia probably where you'll see a clash between the coalition and Labor over those standards.
Could I just jump in on EVs? This is, I think, definitely the slow burn sleeper issue of this election cycle. You had Chris Bowen, the Energy Minister, come out and say that by 2028, under the emission standards that he's hoping to adopt from next year, that Australia will be on par with the US. The news out of the US, which is only, as Adam said, just sort of reports coming now from unnamed officials in the administration, that they're looking to slow that, is a really big problem for Labor. There's been criticism of some of the numbers that are being thrown around of the effect of Labor's policy on EVs. What they're looking at doing is applying a cap on the fleet. So sell as many petrol guzzlers as you want, but you've got to offset it with EVs. Obviously, a company is going to look to do something in the middle. But the government and the department themselves acknowledge they haven't done any modelling on demand. They have looked at overseas examples and said, well, in overseas examples, manufacturers have valued market share more than their profit, and they have just allowed their profit to be eaten into while they adjust. But the Australian market situation is actually quite different. We've a small population, people drive very far, and we're right-hand drive, so yeah, right-hand drive, right. So, yeah, left to right. So there are actually a lot of costs involved with for manufacturers to bring cars into line for us, and for Chris Bowen to continually stand up and say, well, because overseas there was no price rise on cars, is almost as egregious as some of the modelling that's obviously just applied the caps to 2023 models, assuming there'll be no improvements over the next 5 years. This is the stuff that Dutton is testing in Dunkley, and he will build on it over the next year.
Yeah, and that, of course, goes to the Nationals putting pressure on, generally on net zero again.
Oh, it's huge. The debate is open.
Yeah. So we're back to that, Scott Morrison, who is criticised a lot, but also tried to neutralise that issue and tried to, after the failure of Malcolm Turnbull to kind of take them with him, going to that conference with the 2050 commitment was a really big deal. But the Nationals, and obviously, Barnaby Joyce, that's another story, has been trying to really fire this up again. Boom, boom. Fire it up, because it is being fired up.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a problem.
Adam, I might stick on the energy policy topic for a bit. And, in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act is driving a lot of economic activity and are driving a lot of activity in the energy sector as well. How is that playing out, and how we still haven't seen a substantive policy response to that in Australia? So what are the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act on Australia, and how might we be able to respond to that from a domestic policy perspective?
Yeah, look, it's a very complicated question. I don't have all the figures with me, but I do know the cost of the climate components of the Inflation Reduction Act have actually doubled now, because the cost is based on usage of tax credits, and the usage has been huge by American businesses. These are tax incentives to embrace solar power, wind power, whether it's kind of businesses themselves that manufacture or actual energy companies themselves. So there has been a huge boom in the cost and the usage, and I guess that is ultimately going to reduce emissions. But I think there's around the world, not just in the US, there's been a big increase in pessimism, I think, about to what extent we can reduce emissions without nuclear power, basically. I mean, look at Germany. I mean, that's the poster child of this, right? It spent trillions of dollars, and now it's using even more coal than it was, kind of 10 years ago. I mean, don't quote me on that exact figure, but it's something like that. And there's a lot of despondence. I mean, there's the IRA. So the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, has a lot of subsidies, which other governments have complained about. French government's complained a lot. I'm sure the Australian government hasn't complained, but it would be worried because it sucks investment into the US. And so there's the question of whether you try to introduce your own sorts of subsidies. So that's a question, for governments all around the world. But ultimately, these subsidies are being paid for with your borrowed money. I mean, the US is in an absolute fiscal crisis. I mean, in Australia, we talk about debt and deficit. It's a big focus of the media. But, one thing from being here, you just realise how prudent Australia is, Labor and Coalition, compared to the US, right? I mean, they're running $1 trillion deficit every year, and they have $34 trillion in debt, and they're still, showering their businesses with incentives and subsidies and so forth. So at some point, this is not going to be affordable, and it's going to have to be wound back. The question is when.
And, one of the things Dutton has been championing here is nuclear energy and an area where there is a clear difference in policy between the government and the opposition. Is there any actual community support for nuclear energy? Has that been changing?
Well, no, there's not. But I don't think that is a reason to not have the debate. I mean, the easiest way to describe how, no support there is for nuclear in Australia is we can't even agree where to bury our medical nuclear waste. I don't think anyone's running around saying we shouldn't have X-rays anymore. Yeah. So if we can't get consensus on that, how in the heck are we going to get consensus on nuclear energy, small modular reactors or otherwise? And as soon as the coalition get within sniffing distance of talking genuinely about lifting the moratorium, you will see a Labor campaign saying,
it's going to be in your backyard.
I'm standing here on the sunny coast in Ted O'Brien's electorate, and I think there could be a nuclear reactor here. It will just be a constant, well, would you have one in your electorate kind of conversation, which is obviously unhelpful policy, but very effective politics. The energy clash, I actually don't necessarily think that the coalition will come with a huge agenda. They will just be looking to tear down a lot of the sort of genuine kind of problems with what Labor is trying to roll out. Chris Bowen has acknowledged that community consultation around offshore wind, the laying of transmission lines through prime agricultural land to connect solar farms and wind farms to the cities that are actually using that energy has been lax. As I flagged, I cannot tell you how many reviews this government is doing. There is a review into that consultation process. PK's right, the net zero debate is up for discussion between transmission lines, EVs, offshore wind. We are right back in it. And I don't know that Labor are necessarily, they haven't kind of demonstrated that what they've chosen to do is, it's certainly not driving down energy bills. What's driving down energy bills is massive subsidies. So they don't necessarily have the runs on the board yet to convince the electorate that their direction is the right one, which opens up that field for the coalition.
Yeah. I do think, though, there's a lesson for the coalition. And, when you hear the national security debate or you hear the net zero debate, you do feel like it's Groundhog Day. And there is a danger in playing out the last election at the next election. And I'm sure there are some smart people in the room warning about that, because every election is different, circumstances change. There's some political traction, particularly on the rollout. But I do think the messages that were sent through in those teal electorates are still resonant, and there are dangers in making that the sole focus as they go forward.
So we've got election coming up in the US later this year. For us, probably sometime early next year.
Maybe.
A couple of questions coming through on how social media is changing the media landscape and politics, particularly when we come to elections. And Adam, I might start with you and on the US view of that. How important is the role of social media in influencing the election outcome?
Look, I think it's increasingly important. I think politicians more and more are trying to go around the mainstream media or the traditional media. I mean, reminds me of RFK, the kind of a long shot outsider candidate who's, polling about 10% in the US, Robert F. Kennedy. I mean, he's basically running a social media campaign, right? Because the mainstream media tends to ignore him. And it's fairly successful. I mean, if you're polling 13, 14%, that's up near Ross Perot territory almost. So that's pretty good. I mean, certainly the Trump side of things, they rely on social media much more because they don't get such a great run in the traditional media. Of course, it leads into the debate about misinformation and what's right and wrong. And that's actually one interesting contrast between Australia and the US that's worth pointing out. I mean, I know Australia is considering this misinformation bill, which is a pretty significant piece of legislation if it's passed. But the US, the Supreme Court, is probably going to strike down the ability of the US government to basically censor people on social media in a big case coming up in May. That's definitely one to watch. But yeah, look, I mean, social media is extremely important. It frustrates traditional media because it's kind of all these people talking to each other, without our permission. But that's the reality of life now. We have to deal with it.
Australian context?
I'm probably going to show my age here. But if someone has said to you in any way in the last 6 months, oh, I saw this or I've heard this is happening, I guarantee if you ask them when they saw it, it was TikTok. And even if it wasn't the platform, it was a TikTok video that's migrated into their preferred social media platform. I do not think anyone has fully understood the stronghold that format of communication now has on our society. And particularly TikTok, not to go all China hawk, but we really don't know a lot about how its algorithms work. In fact, we often just know that it's pretty dangerous the way that they serve up videos. People, if you have the platform yourself, you probably know that you can lose hours on it.
Yep.
And I think that there's obviously been a constant trend since the advent of social media of people going into silos, having conversations among themselves about their preferred topics in their preferred context. But I don't think we are yet to understand fully what this advent of video has done, where it's almost there's not even debate sometimes, like you are just constantly consuming, and the more you consume, the more you'll be told the same thing at just such a higher level than Twitter or Facebook or Instagram were ever able to achieve in such a short space of time. I mean, Biden joined TikTok last week. Like, it is happening. So I don't have an answer to, how much that has affected things, but it has. And we will probably find out over the course of these 2 elections.
Yes. And the algorithm is, I think, dangerous.
It's vicious.
It's dangerous because it reinforces it's groupthink, right? So if you want to create more polarisation, it's doing it, and, where it's run from. And so we are kind of an open place, and I would like that to stay that way. I don't like the idea of banning things. I think it's a bit weird. But equally, we have to have reckoning with who's controlling the information that we're getting, and we have no control over it. And if it's starting to affect, the misinformation is next level. People believe things that are not true. And I've had reasonable people in my life say, blah, blah, Israel, blah, blah, Palestinians, and because they've seen it on TikTok. And I've said, that's just not true. And it's completely not, there's no sort of, hey, different perspective. It's false. So that's really dangerous. And will it affect elections? Yes, it will.
One other quick thing I would just say about TikTok.
Is it something positive?
No, it's not. But it's just an interesting thing to note. Part of content never expires on TikTok. Like, you know, if you see something on Facebook or Instagram and you see that it was posted 2 days ago, a week ago, you kind of give that context. There is no, in the main interface of that platform, there is no way, you have to actually physically go and see when something was posted, which is resulting in a lot of things going viral. I mean, it's why a lot of old songs are coming back. It's,
and delayed.
Fleetwood Mac, they're back. Yeah. But it's also means that something that Biden said or did in a different context 5, 10, 15 years ago, or the PM did, or even was shared a year ago, or it was shared before Ukraine was invaded, that is just being served up to people with no context of the passage of time. So that's just another interesting scary thing. Sorry.
Well, on that very positive outlook, we are out of time. We will have to finish up this session. Clearly a lot to be on the lookout for, both at home and abroad in the political space this year. It is, you'll be very happy to know, time for lunch. So please head out to the foyer, grab yourself some lunch, but please make sure you're back in the room by 1 o'clock for our afternoon sessions, where we have Nick Bloom and Danielle Wood talking on productivity and the workplace. But before that, please join me in thanking our panellists, Patricia, Claire and Adam.